Good evening, Lake Orion. Welcome to History Now here on ONTV. I'm your host, Anthony Termina. I want to talk to you guys this week about American-Cuban relations during the Cuban Revolution and after the Cuban Revolution. Because I think it's important that if you guys watched my first episode, we talked about the American-Cuban relations before the Cuban Revolution. Now we're going to talk about during and after the Cuban Revolution. At this point, we want to talk to you about Cuba. At this point was ruled by Mr. Fulgencio Batista, who ruled from 1940 to 1944, and also came back into power in a coup from 1952 to 1959. And I made mention earlier that he was very oppressive to his people. He often jailed his opponents, but he also favored relations with the United States. He allowed the Americans to dominate the Cuban economy. He had crime mobs with the American mafia. Also, corporations were coming into Havana and investing their businesses into Cuba. There was clearly a hierarchy between Cubans and Americans. It seemed like the United States would treat Cuba as inferior, whereas Cuba always was resenting the United States meddling in their affairs. In 1959, there was a group that was in Mexico, particularly in the Yucatan Peninsula. There was a group of Cuban Revolutionaries, or also they're sometimes called Cuban thugs or Cuban terrorists, led by Fidel Castro, his brother Raul Castro, and Che Guevara. Che Guevara he promoted and encouraged revolutions all over Latin America based upon where all land to the people. So in 1959, these revolutionaries, or terrorists or thugs, depending on how you call them, landed in Cuba and started war with the Batista government, knowing full well that the Batista regime was very unpopular. They took advantage of they were able to get popular support from the Cuban people. And as a result, they were able to, a massive civil war occurred in Cuba where there was massive fighting that was taking place. There was, however, a lot of members of the Cuban army began to desert Batista, and Castro and Guevara was able to gain some success, especially in that northeastern part of Cuba, and it would eventually spread into Havana, where Batista fled. Originally, he wanted asylum in the United States, but the United States would not give him the asylum, so he ended up going out towards Spain, into Portugal, into Spain, but also into Spain. And the Castro regime was able to take power in Cuba. At this point, in 1958, the United States placed an embargo on Cuba, which also further hurt the Batista regime, because Batista was hoping that the United States would support and help him out during his time in the fighting these Cuban revolutionaries, or thugs, depending on what you want to call them. And the United States just simply refused, and they ended up getting an embargo on. They ended up placing an embargo on Cuba as a whole. Now, this embargo is significant because it still stands to this day, and it is a point of tension between the United States and Cuba. Cuba has long hoped that the embargo would eventually one day be lifted, but it is still in effect to this day. So once Castro took power, once Castro took Havana, they made moves to privatize all American land in Cuba, privatized all American businesses, all American interests. This destroyed the mafia, because a lot of the lands that in Cuba were controlled by the mafia. So this caused a lot of friction between the mafia and the Castro regime. There was privatization of land, particularly of American land, and giving that land to, quote, the government, to the people, well, to the government mostly. It was privatized by the government. All businesses were to be taken over by Cubans and Cubans only. That caused further friction between the United States and Cuba. Also, Fidel Castro favored relations with the Soviet Union. At this point, the Cold War was going on between the United States and the Soviet Union, and for the Soviet Union to be so close to the American mainland caused great concern in the United States. The Soviets tried to justify this of, hey, you've got European countries, you've got Turkey, they're all near our borders, they're friendly to you, so why can't we be friends with Cuba? So you saw the relationships was improving between the Soviet Union and Cuba. There was pictures of Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, and Fidel Castro hugging each other. Castro would also make friends with other well-known Americans like Malcolm X, particularly within the civil rights era. So there also Che Guevara was starting to become popular in Latin America. He would encourage revolutions in Latin America, particularly against United States interests. There was also attempted revolutions in Africa, which the Cuban government would support. The United States would, in response, try to either rein in or also even kill Castro. There were 8 attempts from 1960 to 1965, attempts to kill Fidel Castro. There was the Bay of Pigs invasion, where about 1,500 Cuban exiles, mostly from Florida. At this point, following the revolution, many Cubans fled, mostly to the United States. And mostly they were either supporters of Batista or they were concerned that Castro was going to make Cuba into a communist country, which is what eventually happened. So many families fled Cuba, mostly by boat, and mostly to the United States, and mostly to Florida, which, if you notice in Florida, they have a very strong Cuban population and a lot of resentment towards Castro because of what the Cuban regime had become. But there was the Bay of Pigs invasion, where 1,500 Cuban exiles were trained by the CIA, and they were able to land in Cuba. But once they were in Cuba, the invasion was immediately crushed. The exiles were either imprisoned or killed by the government. Also, Castro would also imprison his political opponents. Freedom of the press was suppressed. Not saying that it wasn't during the Batista regime. That was also, freedom of the press was also suppressed. But many journalists were jailed. Many writers were jailed. Some were tortured. Some were murdered. So Cuba became a full-fledged communist island by 1960, 1961. Guantanamo remained a point of contention. The United States argued they have a base there. There was fears of losing Guantanamo. So there was always that friction between the Castro government and the American presidents, American regimes. It came to a head in 1962, where we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviet Union was supplying missiles into Cuba. They were aiming it towards Florida, towards the United States. There was alarms. It was truly very, very scary. There was a potential nuclear catastrophe about to unfold over what was happening in Cuba. Castro was encouraging the Soviets to use missiles on American cities. Kennedy was he blockaded Cuba. There was also negotiations behind the scenes between the United States and the Soviet Union. There was a standoff, basically, a global standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union all over what was going on in Cuba. So as a result, there were bases all over, and it was just, you feared that World War III was about to begin, that a nuclear invasion, a nuclear war was going to begin. But eventually, there was a compromise that was reached. The Soviet Union agreed to take their missiles out of Cuba. In return, the United States would secretly take their missiles out of Turkey. But it was seen as the Soviet Union would back down, and they took their missiles out of Cuba. That caused friction between Castro and Khrushchev, and as a result, that caused some distrust between Cuba and the Soviet Union. Cuba would maintain relations with both the Soviet Union and with Communist China. But also Cuba would develop relations with third world countries. Countries in Africa, particularly in Africa, the Middle East, also, most importantly, Latin America. Cuba wanted relations with Latin America. At this point, though, the United States had tremendous support from the Latin American countries, particularly amongst presidents that were pretty much seen as dictators. Members in the military. United States would often support military dictatorships, as we would see in Brazil, as we would see in with the intent of wiping communism off the map. And Cuba was seen as that communist country, and that the United States wanted to make sure that no one could have relations with Cuba, at least in the Latin American, Central America, South America, at least in the Americas. So Cuba was excluded out of many conferences, out of many America's summits. That caused a lot of resentment within several Latin American countries who felt that Cuba was essentially a Latin American country that was a part of. They were in Latin America, so that caused a lot of resentment from other Latin American countries towards the United States, because Cuba was a Latin American country, but Cuba was also a communist country. And as we made mention, about 125,000 people approximately left Cuba for Florida, the United States, especially Florida. There would continually be economic turmoil in Cuba. If you've watched any of my episodes about communism, the Soviet Union, the economy becomes stagnant in communist countries. And that happened here in Cuba. There was no investment. There was no market investment. Everything went to the state. And that caused a lot of economic turmoil in Cuba. Also, the embargo. The embargo, it prevented several countries, especially in the United States, to do business in Cuba. Cuba had to invest business elsewhere. They had to do business several Latin American countries resented the United States because of the embargo. So Cuba had to look elsewhere to do business with other countries. Cuba had relations with Iran, who was seen as the United States rival at the time. They would have business with countries, other third world countries that would do business. And as I said, Che Guevara was seen as a revolutionist, but he was eventually taken down by American CIA-trained operatives. And Che Guevara in Cuba is seen as a hero. When we come back, we're going to talk about the Cold War, the end of the Cold War in Cuba, and how that Cold War in the United States and the Soviet Union, and how that impacted Cuba here on History Now, here on ONTV. Hello, Oakland County. This is Sammy Terramina talking OAA Now. In it, we'll talk various stories ranging from the state to Oakland County teams affecting the OAA. Catch us here on OAA Now. Welcome back to History Now here on ONTV. I'm your host, Anthony Terramina. I want to talk to you about, the Cold War has just ended. There's massive tension between the United States and Cuba. Cuba is in economic turmoil. The United States has just won the Cold War. So at this point, the United States is continuing relations as usual. Cuba is starting to become a decaying country. It's still ruled by Fidel Castro. There had at this point started to begin to be, the embargo was still in effect. Cuba was in turmoil, but there was a little bit of easing of tension. There was still some incidences. In 2000, you had the issue of Elian Gonzalez, the young boy that was, his mom and him went to Florida, and he was to live a better life. His mother would die, unfortunately, while coming to the United States. The relatives would pick him up, and they would live in Florida for a time. The father, who was in Cuba, who was not very happy that he was in Cuba to begin with. So that led to a bitter custody battle between the Cuban government, which the dad, which was supported by the Cuban government, and the United States. So as a result, the Cubans had jurisdiction over Elian. There was a well-seen, documented, that American customs agents had to retrieve Elian by force to bring back to Cuba, and Elian Gonzalez was brought back to Cuba, where he is seen as a hero in Cuba. But there was a lot of serious resentment between United States supporters, between those who, especially in Florida, where they wanted Elian Gonzalez to stay in the United States under the custody of his relatives, but he was in Cuba, he was taken back, and there was a lot of resentment towards Janet Reno over that particular incident. There was easing of tension between the United States and Cuba, but there was always that resentment between the Cuban exiles in Florida and the Castro government. There still is to this day. Bill Clinton was seen shaking hands with Fidel Castro at UN meetings. There was, but the American government denied that and continues to deny that to this day. Baseball, which is very popular in both the United States and Cuba. There was an exhibition contest between the Cuban national team and the Baltimore Orioles. there was several, and still several Cubans would defect, knowing that there was a better life in the United States. They would either go by boat, traveling to the Keys, traveling to Florida. So several Cubans would defect to the United States in hopes of having a better life, and in many cases, having that better life. So there was a lot of Cubans who defected, but there was exhibitions that would occur between the Orioles and Cuban national team. When you look at relations between the United States and Cuba, you have to look at which political party is in charge. If the United States is ruled by the Democratic Party at present, there was easing of tension between the United States and Cuba. There was favor of better relations between the American and Cuban governments. If the United States is under Republican leadership, there was often the supporting of the embargo, favoring the Cuban exiles in Florida. There was that tightening that noose of the sanctions between the United States and Cuba. Also, we've noticed some changes between Cuba and the United States amongst ordinary Cubans. It seemed like the younger generation in Cuba would like to see a relationship renewed between the United States and Cuba, but the older generation, especially those who had escaped the tyranny in Cuba, were in favor of not having relationships with Cuba, particularly amongst the Castros. If the Castros and if the regime was taken out of the picture, they would favor a type of normalization of relations. Well, in 2000, George W. Bush, a Republican, took power. His ambassador, John Bolton, identified Cuba as a member of the axis of evil. In the smaller point of view, there was the bigger one, which Bush sent in 2001, was Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. But 2001, Bolton added Cuba to that list. Bolton was the American ambassador to the United Nations at that time in 2001. Also, there was the outpost Condoleezza Rice in 2004 put Cuba into the group of outposts of tyranny. Cuba was also put on the terrorist list. But during that time, Cuba did offer, during the Hurricane Katrina disaster, offered aid to the United States, which that aid was rejected. But at least Cuba made an attempt to offer support towards the American public. But it seemed like as long as Castro was in power, that business would never occur between the United States and Cuba. Well, in 2008, Raul Castro takes power after Fidel steps down in 2008. At this point, Americans have a new president in Barack Obama. In this case, relations improve. There was opening reachings. There was talks in the Vatican. There was openings in the American Summit of the Americas. Cuba at this point now is a full-fledged member. There was openings between relations between the United States and Cuba. There were flights that were taking place from Miami to Havana. Businesses slowly but surely were starting to do business in Cuba again. It seemed like there's beginning to be a normalization of relations. However, opposition still remains. Americans have a new president coming in, Donald Trump, who is a Republican, who has favored a tougher stance on Cuba, favoring a tougher stance in favor of the Cuban exiles. Fidel Castro died recently. There was massive celebrations in the streets of Little Havana, which is in Florida. Several senators oppose relations between the United States and Cuba. Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, amongst several others. There's opposition that's going to remain. And there's also that feeling that still remains that Americans see Cubans as inferior, and Cubans resent American occupation in Cuba. One story I'd like to share real quick is 1900, the 1900 Galveston hurricane. The Cubans released their reports saying that the hurricane was going to hit Texas. Many American weathermen up in the United States refused to believe it, thinking that it was going to get through Florida and go right off the Atlantic and head northeast. But in that case, the Cubans were right. And that created some trust between the United States and Cuba weather services, especially in the case of a hurricane when the hurricane starts to hit. So there is some relations that are improving between the two, just not in governmental affairs between two countries. Cuba remains a communist country at present. Raul Castro is in power. For as far as relations go, it's really up to the United States and Cuba whether they want to take the relationship, where they want to go with it going forward. That decision should be up to both countries. I think both countries want relations with the other. It's just the question is, are they going to get it done? That is the question. And we'll have to see what happens going forward, ladies and gentlemen, will there be better relations between the United States and Cuba? Who knows? We'll find out. Well, that does it for this episode of History Now. I'm going to head on off soon. Have a great new year. And see you soon. Have a good night, Lakecoin.